Hello and welcome to another Beyond the Table. This has been a ruse. This is all just a delivery mechanism for me to talk about Warhammer 40k. You have been lured in by this. Haha. We're going to talk about more Warhammer 40k. This time with a more specific to tabletop RPG lens. Specifically, the Warhammer 40,000 lore that you need to know to play the tabletop RPGs that go along with it. This could also be titled something like, what does the average Imperial citizen know, or something like that, or like, what do people actually know in the Imperium? But we'll get into that more when we get into this. So, as last time, I am joined by Alex.
Hey, woody woo.
But unlike last time, the rest of the cast is here as well, because my mind poison knows no bounds and must be spread to all the cast members.
Hello, yes, I have been brought into the terror that is Warhammer.
It's super funny because over a decade ago, I swore off of Warhammer 40k, and now I'm back, I guess, in this Imperial relapse. But I trust Charlie to be kind and, well, never mind. I trust Charlie to guide me through this with grace.
Yes, and with that in mind, Alex, what are the two most important rules to keep in mind when talking about Warhammer 40,000?
Hold on. I think I remember them. Number one, everything is completely blown out of proportion or overly exaggerated or something like that.
It's all satire. Yeah, I'll give it to you on that one.
It's all satire, yeah. And two, the sole purpose of Warhammer 40k is to sell very expensive small plastic figurines.
Yes, all of this goddamn lore we are about to talk about in painful detail exists to sell fucking plastic war miniatures.
What else would it exist for?
Decades of lore, hundreds of books, billions of pages exist to make sure you keep buying fucking war miniatures. And it's one of the best sci-fi fantasy tabletop RPG settings ever, because I'm assuming that you listened to the previous episode we did on this. That was kind of the timeline of all of this, or that you are at least a little bit familiar with Warhammer 40,000 lore. We're not going to go into the basic knowledge. I'm not going to recap kind of the timeline or who the various factions are. We'll talk about the various factions a little bit in context. It's important here, but yeah, I'm operating on the assumption you have listened to our timeline episode that kind of gives a real surface level overview, which is terrifying to think about how long that episode is, of the setting and the lore and the stuff inside of it, or already know some 40k lore. So yeah, welcome. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend go checking that out, but also you might learn something from this too, and be curious about that as well. This is very specifically kind of the 40k lore you need to know to play the various tabletop RPGs. And yes, we are still not a 40k lore channel. It's not changing any time. This did really well for the algorithm for us previously. And yeah, expect some jargon and some lingo and all that stuff going on. So all the Warhammer 40,000 tabletop RPGs are written from the human perspective. I know a couple of them add the ability to play as non-human characters, but the general assumption across the board in almost everything except like the RTS and or strategy game type of stuff, like across medium, is that you wind up playing as humans. Most video games you play as humans or something very close to human. Looking at you, Fire Warrior, like Dark Tide, you are all technically humans except the Ogre, and that's just kind of a type of human. I don't know necessarily why this is the case, mostly because the Imperium, aka humans, is the most popular faction by a significant degree in the setting. And yeah, it's generally safe to assume that when you're talking about tabletop RPGs that take place in Warhammer 40,000, you are talking about a game in which you play a human or a variant of a human. And yeah, I think that's kind of an important detail to keep in mind, I guess, to kind of get a better sense where people are at. Do people know all the kind of various human factions?
I mean, vaguely.
I don't remember them all.
I know the faction with the buff women.
Fair enough. Sisters of Battle. We will be talking about them a little bit later. So yeah, to kind of take it further, the majority of tabletop RPGs that take place in Warhammer 40k, you play as relatively regular ass human. At time of recording this, the two kind of mainline, mainstream, current, modern, whatever the hell you want to call it, tabletop RPGs are the game Imperial Maledictum, which in which you play kind of a variety of relatively normal ass humans, and Wrath and Glory, which is the more kind of combat focused one where you play everything from Imperial Guardsmen up to Space Marines. I think that one has options for playing as orcs in it, but basically they're just swapping orc and human because it kind of makes sense from a physicality standpoint, but we'll get to that in a little bit later on in this. But yes, so I'm going to kind of talk through this assuming that it's all from the perspective of humans. I think it's kind of the easiest approach for that. For tabletop RPGs, for the most part, you will be kind of playing from that perspective, some variation of that evolutionary ladder. So to start this off, let's talk about the important Imperial history. To back up a step, despite the insane amount of lore that exists for Warhammer 40,000, in spending some time researching this, I've learned that the average player character doesn't know shit about the setting, which I found kind of fascinating because despite it being a spacefaring, super advanced in the future, kind of like, hey, we have warp drive that just goes through hell, et cetera, it's kind of this interesting dichotomy where most people don't leave the planet they're from. Most people don't leave, in most cases, the main city they're from. Hell, here's kind of an interesting example I came across. Who here knows a lot about the Gaulish Wars the Romans were involved in?
I do.
But, like, would you know all the generals or just kind of the various events that happened?
Yeah, that's the war with France, or, well, modern-day France, right?
More Germany.
Yeah, like the... okay, so that's like... you're talking about Roman Empire era.
Yes.
I know less about that than the Gallic Wars.
I only bring this up to illustrate the point that was relatively recent history for us. Warhammer timelines are done by millennia. A lot of shit gets forgotten. And to assume that the average-ass citizen knows anything about any of these kind of time periods we're about to kind of blaze through real quick is an assumption that I think game masters need to keep in mind because, like, honestly, how much pre-World War I world conflict history all of us know off the top of our head is a sad commentary, I think, on things. Anyways, basically everything that kind of exists in tabletop RPGs at this point exists basically post-line called the Horus Heresy. We talked about in more detail in kind of the previous time we talked about this, but the Great Rebellion that kind of sets the Imperium on its slow path to decay. It's weird to say this from a tabletop RPG perspective. Nothing prior to that point matters, which is really weird to say because that's give or take 30 millennia of lore playing out. And yeah, there's some Dark Age of technology stuff, but mostly it's anything that kind of exists prior to that point is basically kind of like super space magic or folklore levels of stuff. No one really knows what happens, and the setting is even like the lore that exists is deliberately kind of vague and obtuse about exact details that happen during any of this. So like even I, as a game master, kind of you as someone that maybe knows a lot about lore, the details of this time period are a little bit sketchy. Like some weird stuff happens, and there's also this whole running thing that every single book lore thing that exists for Warhammer 40,000 is deliberately written to be unreliable because it's propaganda of some kind or another, but that's kind of an easy cop-out for writing inconsistencies. But anyways, the generally speaking, kind of all the stuff exists in this in what's called the Age of the Imperium, which is Millennium 31 to, quote, the present in the setting. And during that time period, you have a variety of kind of different time periods. You have basically this kicks off with the end of the Horus Heresy, something called the Time of Rebirth, which is the scouring and kind of the arguable peak of humans kind of thing. Like it's all downhill from this point on. And a lot of stuff gets set in motion in this bizarre time period that kind of trickles down to the modern era. This is as good as it gets for humans. It's lots of hunting traders, et cetera, et cetera. It's followed by a time period called forging. That's kind of when the slow death of everything starts. And that's when something called the Adeptus Administratum, or the Ecclesiarchy, or as Chad mentioned earlier, the buff women in power armor kind of start to become a thing. A big chunk of the setting of Warhammer 40,000 is something called the Imperial Creed, the Imperial Cult, Cult Imperialis, and it's the worship of Big E, the God Emperor, Big Emps, if you will, as kind of this divine figure, despite him not ever wanting to, and the kind of slow drift to theocracy that causes basically everything bad to happen throughout the setting for humans. Yeah, so I guess kind of on a timeline, we were at kind of the 32nd to 35th millennia of these types of things, and this is when things start to get bad, and this is the end of things being good for humans. And I'm bringing all this up because basically from that point on, it's an ongoing for quite a few millennia of civil war and power grabs and consolidations of power of the Imperial Church that lead to the setting as it currently exists, which is obsessed with heresy and heretics and witch burning. And the reality is your player characters probably won't know any of this shit. They're just dealing with the after effects of a once great kind of imperialistic, definitely fascist adjacent, if not a explicitly fascist kind of techno society, slowly drifting into god worship and then explicitly drifting into god worship. And yeah, there's kind of a variety of important figures that go throughout this. There's a character named Doge Van Dyer, who's been memed to hell in the modern era as Doge Van Dyer, who is in setting one of the worst people to ever exist. You can trace almost everything wrong with the Imperium kind of directly back to him, but no one actually really knows about him because of something we'll talk about in a few minutes. But yeah, basically safe to say, ever since Biggie went on the throne and kind of stopped being an active participant in his Imperium, it's been a slow drift towards theocracy, and we find ourselves in a setting where witch hunting and heretic pyres and getting executed for just questioning the status quo despite being a little bit overblown isn't that overblown, and the average existence of the average human kind of sucks. Are we all following so far?
Yes, sir.
So, and kind of to go into the quote big human stuff that I assumed, so I think I mentioned this, but kind of to reiterate this, when I started kind of digging around on what player characters would know about this, I made some assumptions that were just dead wrong. And I think one of the most interesting things I came across was this phrase of the Emperor and his 9 sons. For those of us familiar with the setting, there are fucking 20, maybe 21 Primarchs. What the fuck does this 9 mean? So it's basically the idea that, and kind of it's interesting to talk about this because we're all aware that demons exist in this bizarre sci-fi setting, right?
Yeah.
I was waiting until you got to like the demons sort of situation where it was like, when do the demons kick in?
Yes. Yeah. So one of Biggie's kind of big things was the idea that, like, and this is kind of the hypocrisy of the setting from a human perspective, the Emperor was profoundly like anti-religion, not atheist. I mean, like anti-religion. Like the only correct usage of priests and religious text is kindling. And the idea behind this basically was that if people don't believe in gods, the very real eldritch beings known as the chaos gods can't get their footholds and stuff. And it's not really how it winds up working in the grand scheme of things. But the Emperor's idea was like, hey, if no one in humanity worships the kind of powers of chaos, we can starve their asses out. Didn't work. Half his kids, half the Primarchs going off to become chaos Primarchs, etc., etc. Horus Heresy happens. Modern history, because of the Emperor's direction, has scrubbed any mention of the traitor Primarchs from it, any mention of basically the Horus Heresy, any mention of what the fuck exactly went down. I found some interesting things that basically refers to it as like the Emperor and his 9 sons fighting the 9 like usurper warlords or something. And this is kind of when the propaganda aspects of this stuff kicks in. Like, the setting itself has spent a lot of time removing chaos as a concept from the setting, despite the fact that, like, psychers exist, but also they're not tapping into the warp. They're just weirdos that can do psychic things. Yeah, normal psychic things, nothing pan-dimensional nightmare fuel about their powers, even though they occasionally explode at random or shit like that, or the fact that our space travel works by passing through basically literal and figurative hell. These are not necessarily known things about kind of the setting as it works. And an ongoing theme is that like a lot of the stuff has been covered up, and most characters, unless they're Space Marines, probably don't know anything I just talked about. It's not important to their humdrum lives. It's been kind of badly taught to them. It's the Inquisitors and Space Marines and up. Maybe Sisters of Battle. Definitely not kind of your Imperial Guard know any of the shit I just talked about, which made pulling together something about this complicated, because I think it's important from a player perspective to understand kind of the history of a 10 millennia kind of slide from technological superiority to religious fervor. But like for most average citizens of the Imperium, they're just kind of going through it, and their engagement with the God Emperor, kind of the belief in that, is a little bit their own choice, but also not worshiping the God Emperor is a great way to get a round through the back of your skull for heresy, whether or not you're doing anything heretical or not, despite the fact that the God Emperor would have agreed with you.
This is very Dune.
Yes. One of the things lobbed at the Warhammer 40,000 universe, a lot of frequency, is how liberally it borrows from Dune and other famous sci-fi works. I think I have explained to Alex a while back. A lot of the kind of really cool stuff in Warhammer 40,000 is a little bit kind of reprocessed or reinterpreted ideas from a myriad of other places type of thing. And some of the best concepts are kind of this grimdark spin on an existing sci-fi kind of idea that's mashed in with some other stuff going on. But yeah, it's kind of the history of things. It's kind of weird because I think it's important for players to kind of understand that weird fucked upness, but also it's 0% important because your characters wouldn't fucking know about it, weirdly enough.
Which makes sense, because like the only thing I remember about U.S. history in 4th grade or 5th grade or wherever the heck it was, I think it was in 5th grade, is Johnny Tremaine, and I didn't even pay attention. So like, if you were to tell me anything about like, hey, describe Boston, I can only tell you about Newbury Comics, and I don't even know where that's at.
It's a chain, yeah.
All I know is it's kind of close to the music school.
Not wrong.
It's kind of a relief to be able to not, I guess, feign ignorance, but really just kind of like when we need to download the information about 40K lore, it can just be given to us in terms of like, here's a snippet, so that way you can understand the context rather than an expectation of like, I need to know an alternate future textbook of info in order for me to make this role make sense.
Yeah. So, and I guess using that's a great bridge for this, let's go into what I'm going to call what the average Imperial citizen actually knows. And I apologize for the big rambling part before this. This is the important part, actually. Like, if you jump to this part, welcome to the actual part. This is what we're going to be talking about for this. So let's start with the basics of what an average Imperial citizen actually knows. And they don't really know this. It's more this is kind of life. So average Imperial citizen works a 14-hour day, give or take, depending on their situation. Yes, there are some high lords, and we'll get into that in a couple minutes. We get into kind of some of these different worlds. But basically, your existence in a Warhammer setting is dictated by basically where you're born. The roll of the dice, if you're unlucky enough to be born on the wrong planet, guess what? And generally speaking, there are 7 types of planet. They are agricultural worlds, feral worlds, feudal worlds, forge worlds, hive worlds, shrine worlds, and death worlds. Anyone want to guess which the best of those options to be born on is?
Forest? It's forest, right?
No, I did not.
Damn it. No, there was something.
Brian.
I agree.
Dylan's probably the closest correct. With an asterisk on that because some agricultural worlds are fucking nightmares. So basically, the way the Imperium works is your planet's main function and purpose is dictated by what that planet can do. Agri worlds stand for agricultural worlds. you provide the food to the rest of the Imperium, whether that is in the form of giant planet-spanning farms of nutritional algae, giant vats of edible yeast, corpse start manufacturing. Hell, your planet might be the planet that grows apples. It's a weird setting that way where, yeah, you're going to work probably 14, 16 hours a day, but like, it's at least farming. Maybe it's kind of not shit. Like, your main export is something you're probably going to have enough to eat, probably, give or take. Depending on kind of the instance and the setting, it ranges from like uber mega corporate farm to big farm to like a bunch of small independent farms doing something weird that like all work towards the planetary tithe, which is like, hey, we have to send enough X off the planet every year through every cycle to keep the Imperial taxman off our back. And if you don't pay the Imperial taxman enough, either super soldiers show up or they just blast your planet from orbit into dust. Both of these happen. But yeah, agricultural worlds are probably the best to be from. There's an argument to be made that feral or feudal are a second best because, as the name implies, they're just kind of planets that are a little bit technologically de-advanced. Feral is kind of maybe as far back as hunter-gatherer. Typically, at least, like, the air is clear and stuff like that. And you're just kind of there doing stuff. There are so many Imperial worlds that they will recruit cavemen, train them how to speak Common, or Gothic, I guess, or probably Low Gothic in that case, and throw them at the front lines, because, hey, bodies need to go kind of thing. But, yeah, feudal, similar thing. Typically, it's kind of pre-industrial revolution, like literally kings and queens and lords and that type of shit. My notes here say Renfest, but terrible constantly. These get weird because there are these things called Imperial Knights that are like Arthurian knights that like believe in chivalry and all that shit that drive skyscraper tall mecha, but they often come from weird planets that are like still obsessed with courtly manners, but also then have like people maintaining giant walker death machines. So yeah. Next up, we have Forge to kind of complete the F section of this. Forge is exactly as it sounds. Your planet makes shit. Maybe it's refining materials. Maybe it's making tanks. Maybe it's making scroll parchments. Who knows? But again, from a life perspective, you probably live in a highly industrialized society. There's a chance you never see the sun because ecological impact is not a thing that this setting cares about in the least. There's always more planets, and you don't need that vitamin D anyway. Supplements for that. My notes here for this say the planet's basically one giant factory, most likely, and life sucks, but it could be worse. Which leads us to Hive, which is where I think most, if not almost all, that's a broad assumption, majority of tabletop RPGs using Warhammer 40k will probably take place in hives and on a hive planet or in a hive city at a minimum. Not unique to Warhammer 40k, but kind of brought to its grim dark extreme is the Hive City, a giant city, often so tall it literally reaches to the planetary stratosphere, and so deep it often reaches like several miles potentially below the surface's crust, of just cities stacked on top of cities, stacked on top of cities, stacked on top of city. And literally it's class warfare of the lower you are down, the significantly worse life is. It is quite possible to have never seen the sun because you're just so far down the Hive City that, yeah. I say that most of the setting, that most kind of tabletop RPGs take place in these things because it's just a big-ass setting. You want to have a labyrinth of sewer tunnels, you got it. You want to have courtly intrigue, also present in the same cities that go up and down type of. From a kind of tabletop RPG story perspective, Hive Cities are great because you can kind of, within reason, just make stuff up that are in them. They're basically kind of like giant generation spaceships crashed into planets, and that comes with like, oh, you have all the royals on the top in a situation where it's like, oh yeah, we're above all the pollution, but we're so far above the pollution, there's no air left to breathe, actually. We have to live in kind of these vacuum-sealed towers, quite literally. And yeah, we will come back to this, but this is kind of where everything we've talked about so far, maybe not the Forge planets, Forge worlds, populations are pretty consistent. Like there's probably a shared culture across the boards. Forge, definitely Hive is where things start to get weird because of the like billions of people shoved into one city that may not even be the one city on a planet. You have a lot of stuff like mutants and xenos and psychers potentially about in your setting there. And if something bad's going to happen, it's because there's just so many people that flew under the radar. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. As a Jad guessed, Shrine Worlds aren't bad, but they exist with one specific purpose, which is worship of the God Emperor. So they might not be bad from a being their perspective, but they're bad because probably anything that's even slightly heretical ends in your horrific death, if not worse. And what is or is not heretical very much depends on the person screaming heretic at you unironically. I guess it's probably worth explaining what the hell heresy is at this point. Basically, anything that differs from the status quo of the Imperium is potentially heresy. Obviously, not worshiping the God Emperor correctly, and there's some kind of sarcasm on that because God Emperor never wanted to be worshipped. That's people doing everything wrong. It's weird. If you're getting serious, like kind of Salem witch hunter vibes off that, that's correct. That is exactly what this is. It is a lot of people that are innocent in this setting get killed because either someone doesn't like them or they said something like, what if we didn't make bread out of the dead people?
That's right. I forgot to make the bread out of the dead people.
Corpse starch.
Yes.
Gotta recycle that protein.
I mean, like, to view it in a worldview or through a lens that is not our own, you gotta approach these cultures, you know? I mean, yeah, it's super fascist, but that kind of makes sense. Sure.
Yes, but what if I told you, Jad, that the assumption for military deployment rations was also corpse starch because you could just recycle your comrades that die into delicious bricks of nutrients?
I mean, sometimes it's like, I just don't want to cook breakfast, you know, and I just end up having a meal replacement powder. So, like,
Hans tastes better than Sue did.
Yeah.
Welcome to Warhammer 40k. All right, last but not least is my favorite of the options for kind of types of world that's Death World. There's no set definition of a Death World, just typically it means that a planet either subconsciously or actively wants to kill you. And despite what I assume you're thinking of, yeah, people don't live there, people totally live on Death Worlds. One of the more famous kind of human military groups is called the Akatachan Jungle Fighters. This entire kind of culture of everyone is Rambo living on a planet that, like, the flora and fauna maybe hive mind together. At a minimum, it wants to kill every single living thing on the planet. So, like, every man, woman, and child is armed with, like, a Rambo knife and a flamethrower to constantly wage war against the jungle around them. And they're doing it well enough that they're capable of sending lots of people off-world to serve in the intergalactic military. So, yeah, Death Worlds are wacky. My notes here is life is terrible and everything wants to kill you, and the air might kill you too. This ranges from planets that are just like insanely cold to irradiated wastelands to places that were one of the other worlds we talked about that because of something bad happening or human decisions became Death Worlds. That occasionally happens too. And just for reference, all of these we talked about are the normal planets. There's lots of other weird ones. Like, there's definitely a planet of the setting that's just a giant person and people live in the pores of that person. He's like in the fetal position or something.
That's actually kind of tight. That's actually really cool.
Fucking Chaos does some wacky ass shit. Then that person got grown big as punishment by Slanesh or something. I know, like, the fucking Emperor's children, I think, are the ones that live on that thing and, like, live in the pores and stuff like that. So that's a whole nightmare unto itself. But yeah.
How many points would that planet be?
Points?
You know, if you're playing the non-tabletop version, the non-RPG version.
The person planet's in constant, perpetual agony. Being a planet is a horrific experience for them. The punishment.
Oh, it's not like a Unicron sort of situation where
No, this was a person that I think was turned gigantic.
They were not like that. Okay,
no,
that's significantly less. I mean, it's still kind of cool, but like that sucks. Yeah, that sucks.
Yes.
It's very monkey's paw science fiction.
Yes. Let's get into the monkeyest paw of the science fiction, I guess, of this. Let's talk about chaos real quick. Chaos is kind of the base of the mysticism of this setting. As I touched on earlier, warp travel in this game, or in this setting, exists by punching a hole into hell, sailing your giant spaceship through it, and hoping bad things don't happen, basically. Yeah, this thing's called Geller Fields, but intergalactic travel involves punching a hole into hell and hoping that, like, the powers of the warp and or chaos don't decide to turn your ship into a living demon or make it grow fur or, like, turn the air into fire inside the ship or worse. The warp is a bad place, and chaos is broken down into kind of demons, which we talked about a little bit earlier, like literal demons. Like I could not be more literal in saying demons on this one. And the people that have chosen to either worship the powers of chaos or live in the warp on various chaos planets, like the plague planet, which is one giant kind of ball of disease and pain and suffering, but a whole other separate topic. To build off the monkey's paw example Jad provided, anything you can think of that's terrible probably exists in the warp. And if it doesn't, when you think of it in the setting, it does by the time you're done thinking about it, probably. Because some demon thought that idea sounded cool. I digress some. Yeah, it's to kind of wind it back to the tabletop RPG perspective of things. You're going to run into chaos cultists, probably. Demons are unbelievably rare, so much so that, like, the existence of demons is actually pretty goddamn classified, and normal people like you get killed all the time for knowing about demons existing. Hell, there's an entire chapter of Space Marines that only fight demons, basically, that tend to purge entire planetary populations if they learn about their existence, because secrecy and whatnot, and basic humans are pretty expendable in the setting. But yeah, we didn't talk about this much. We'll talk about this some in a couple minutes. Space Marines are probably the thing most people know about. The average human probably doesn't know that Chaos Space Marines are a thing, which in lore leads to lots of fun moments of Space Marines showing up on planets and people being like, hooray! The Space Marines are here to save us. Why are they covered in spikes and human heads? Oh no, these are apparently evil Space Marines. Why did no one warn us this was a thing? And then bad things ensue. But yeah, depends on the person. We'll get into kind of the big exception on this. If you were a former member of the Imperial Navy or an active member of the Imperial Navy, which is spaceship stuff, or the Imperial Guard, you probably know something about Chaos Space Marines. You definitely haven't met one because you wouldn't probably be alive if that was the case, but maybe you're familiar with the concept. But for the most part, the cults of chaos are probably going to be the thing that you find yourself running into the most. But yeah, I guess any questions about chaos so far, or I guess kind of the backbone of the settings?
None for me yet.
None for me.
Clarification. Chaos has just been like a constant sort of otherworldly force, or it's like just literal hell?
Yes. I guess let's go into this for a couple minutes. I guess to rehash the settings there are 4 chaos gods. They are Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle, and Tzeentch. I'm probably pronouncing that slightly wrong. Each one of them kind of represents a bad aspect of humanity, or kind of like, they're all negative forces in setting. There are positive spins you can put on them, but like to run through it quickly. Khorne is the war god. His phrase is literally blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. Khorne does not care from where the blood flows, just that blood flows. He is the god of murder, warfare, blood, death, all that kind of fun stuff. Well, not death, we'll get to that in a second. But basically, Khorne's goal is for you to be murdering each other all the time, constantly. The blood must flow, and worshippers of Khorne are not long-lived because either they're real fucking good pit fighters or they all die in kind of gladiatorial kind of craziness. There's not a lot of good reasons to worship Khorne unless you're like constantly fighting, but that's a whole other separate topic we can go into after we get through more of the stuff people want. Nurgle is the god of death and decay and stagnation, and he is the source of everything from things rusting to plagues that cause people to turn into zombies. The biggest takeaway for him is he is kind of the god of entropy. Everything decays, everything dies, everything comes to an end. It's all inevitable. And also, wouldn't it be great if things just have things to stay the same forever and just kind of rotted away? Nurgle also has the nickname of Papa Nurgle of the 4 Chaos Gods. He's the most nurturing, and a lot of people wind up worshiping him not because he offers them great deals, but because their lives are so terrible that his offer of hey, you won't be in searing pain anymore is a great reason to become a walking human beehive of murder hornets. Tzeentch is the god of change and also magic and bullshit. Alex, do you remember my joke about the true fans of Tzeentch when it comes to playing the game?
I don't.
They are the assholes that when they lose the war game go just as planned. Tzeentch's plans are plans within plans within plans within bullshit that often contradict each other. In the setting, he is kind of the god of mutation and change against your will, and that things must keep changing. The knower of secrets and worshippers of Tzeentch are schemy fucking bastards. He doesn't really care about the end results of things, more the treachery that has to occur along the way, if that makes any sense. He's definitely a process guy, not an end result in the grand scheme of things, but that's a whole separate topic. Last but not least is Slaanesh. He, her thirsts, the Dark Queen, the most recent of the Chaos Gods that came into existence, who's often portrayed as kind of the sex god, but they're really more the god of excess and perfection and obsession, which often goes along with kind of the stereotypes. They are the god that offers you the best drugs, the best escapes, the best hobbies. To worship Slaanesh is to often devote yourself to single-minded dedication to something. Slaanesh just wants you to be the best at what you do. And if in the end of that you realize that human skin is the best leather, so be it. To kind of recap the ongoing joke and memes about Slaanesh, she's the god that was murder fucked her way into existence by the Eldar. Literally their hedonistic lifestyle led to her exploding into existence and tearing a hole in the galaxy.
I was just going to ask if that was the one that got fucked into existence, basically. Yeah. Okay, cool. I remember
I was
that.
going to say, I feel like we're all, unless scienced into existence, are fucked into existence, but I'm pretty sure, especially with the setting and the context in which you're describing this world to us, fucked means completely something a little bit more.
I guess that's kind of a good transition point into the Xenos. The Drukhari and Eldar are the elves of the setting, and they are psychically inclined, and for a long time they were the dominant species of the setting. And to kind of cap the point I made about them previously, their multi-millennia lifestyle of beyond hedonistic excess and obsession and just beyond imagination debauchery mixed with their psychic gifts literally made a god that's main purpose is to eat their souls.
Hell yeah.
That's Slaanesh.
Hell yeah.
But yeah, the average citizen doesn't know any of that shit about chaos. They just know that warp travel is dangerous because reasons, and this is where psychers get interesting, because in most tabletop RPGs you can play a psyker, and psychers are special because their powers come from channeling the warp. I don't want to say they're not actually psychic, because what the fuck does psychic actually mean? But all of their powers are more about kind of using themselves as a conduit and or punching holes in reality and letting the warp through in a controlled manner. The warp is an undefinable space that it's often compared to hell because it's just a nightmare, but it's also a real space. You can fly ships in it. It's got a weird kind of currents to it. It's a giant thing of energy. There are planets that exist inside of it. All 4 gods I mentioned have legit domains. Fucking Nurgle has a giant garden where he grows plagues he sends to planets and shit like that. Slaanesh has a palace with a insane kind of maze around it and stuff like that. Zeech has an ever-changing whatever, and Korn has his fortress, the skull throne and whatnot on it, etc., etc. But is a place with places you can go to that like links up with reality in weird ways that you can sail ships through, and weird things happen, and exposure to it can do everything from mutate you to blast you into a skeleton. And this is where psychers become important, because they can kind of work as everything from kind of walkie-talkies that use the malleable nature of the warp to kind of transmit information across long distances, to dude who can shoot lightning by properly channeling the energies of the warp to shoot lightning. This causes you to become the focus of demons, potentially, that may like erupt out of your body and or possess you, but that's a whole other topic that I'm actually not sure if psychers fully grasp those dangers when they do psycher things. From a tabletop RPG perspective, it's often kind of a mechanic where the more warp shenanigans you do, the more weird shit happens around you, until something real bad potentially happens. But yeah, that's kind of the warp from a tabletop RPG's perspective, and chaos. And I guess, yeah, I guess to kind of like rewind back to answer your question in more detail, chaos is a thing. There are other things in the warp that have nothing to do with the four chaos gods. There's a concept of like the deep warp, where not even the chaos gods go. Like there are parts of the warp so terrifying, no one knows what's there, because people either didn't make it back from there, or no one's been dumb enough to go. But that's a whole other separate topic that's actually not that information about. So, yeah. The things that the average Imperial citizen actually probably knows quite a bit that's useful from a tabletop RPG perspective are Xenos, aka aliens, aka not humans. Not demons and not chaos, but I guess aliens. We touched on Eldar/Drukhari earlier. Generally speaking, humans are fucking racist as shit in this setting, give or take, as a general rule. They would know the Drukhari and or Eldar as, or Eldari, as I have written here, as knife-eared bastards, most likely. They are annoying, they are long-lived, they talk down to you constantly, they quite literally refer to humans as the Monkai, which is the Eldar word for monkey. They have a variety of stories when talking to humans about how their civilization was spanning the galaxy when we lay gasping for breath upon the shore of our primordial oceans. They don't like humans. They think we're pretty fucking shitty and backwards ass, and don't love the fact that we breed like cockroaches as far as they're concerned. Most human interactions with Eldari are probably one of two things, either pirates or raiders. And from a human perspective, the difference between the two different factions of this don't actually matter, because not human knife-eared bastards, but the Drukhari want to kidnap you, to torture you, and worse, to stop Slaanesh from drinking their souls out of their body, and Eldar probably just want your food, or for you to get the fuck away from their chunks of space. They, generally speaking, don't deal with humans unless they need to, except for, and this is kind of where the tabletop RPG part of it comes in, if you're a rogue trader and you realize that maybe diplomatic relations with the Eldar are beneficial to you from a merchant perspective. A lot of what I'm talking about are kind of generic catch-all things. The average Imperial citizen might realize that dealings with the Eldar could be very beneficial to them, and while it's illegal to do so, space is so vast. What are the chances you get caught? But that's kind of the Eldar from a glance at that. The average human would know them. I'm not saying you could know them on sight. Like, in theory, they could cover up their ears, but like they would look oddly sharp-featured and graceful and thin compared to most humans. Often probably a little bit taller, too. Their tech is weird, too. It's often sung into existence, but that's not a detail that's all that important to know about. At the same time, they are probably one of the two factions that the humans can deal with the most. The other one is the Tau, which are blue-skinned aliens that are about the same size as humans. I think they're on average about 6 feet tall, give or take. They're slightly physically weaker. They are the newest kind of the various galactic forces in the setting, and depending on your reading of them, they are the closest the setting has to good guys to space communists. Their whole thing is the greater good, and occasionally humans just defect from the Empire to go serve the greater good, and maybe they get lobotomized and that happens. Maybe something weirder happens. Maybe they become propaganda pieces. We may never fully know, but they are new and naive and don't totally get the Imperium. But at the same time, if you don't fuck with them, they won't fuck with you for the most part. And they're going to try and like evangelize how great the greater good is. And like, what if we all work together to not starve to death? And that's appealing to the average Imperial citizen. They also are kind of somehow technically more advanced technologically than humans are. They are the only faction in the game, I believe, that's figured out actual faster than light travel. And that's because they have no psych. They can't do warp shenanigan shit. Probably not a ton of dealings, though. They're kind of off in Tau space, and humans are off in human space, but who knows? Maybe you get a Tau rifle or something like that. There's a variety of memes out there about them being kind of the anime faction because they make mechs, and that's just wrong. That's the Drukhari. They have Shoryuken-based weapons, but that's a whole other separate topic. We're now going to get into kind of the, I guess, like finishing off the kind of human-ish ones. We have the Votan, which are, I guess, technically the newest faction, even though they're technically older than the Tau in a weird way. They're dwarves. They have no lore. They're too new for lore. One of my favorite factions because they're kind of, they have a cool, tragic backstory. I don't actually know if humans would realize they were dealing with Votan if they were talking to one. They think they're a short human. Because that's a whole thing we'll get into in a couple minutes. Because variants on humans exist. But that leads kind of our three major alien species of Tyranids, the Orcs, and the Necrons. I think humans know about Tyranids for the most part. They are giant bug monsters. As best I can tell, their existence is not classified, just the scope of them. There are multiple Tyranid fleets that pick planets clean from a bio-life standpoint. Like when a Tyranid fleet shows up on your planet, you are, for the most part, probably fucked because they will drink the oceans, absorb the sky, eat every bug in the ground, consume every human, and then fly off, leaving a barren husk of rock behind them type of thing. There's a bunch of really cool stories about like their giant hive ships eating Imperial space stations and then like absent-mindedly digesting the space station kind of for its biomass and useful materials. Not even realizing it had done that. But yeah, if your background is an Imperial Guard or you're playing an Imperial Guard campaign of some kind, these are probably one of the enemies you're most likely to fight. They are a kind of Starship Trooper-esque Helldiver bugs. Hey, there's a fucking lot of them, and they don't really have goals except to feed, and in lore, they just kind of exist to get bodied a lot and or occasionally wipe out planets in mysterious ways. There is an asterisk on that because there's something called gene stealer cults that the average human definitely does not know about. And gene stealer cults are basically humans that get infected by Tyranids and subconsciously make planet-spanning cults that, unbeknownst to them, are preparing the entire planet populace for a Tyranid invasion. Like, they feel compelled to do things that, like, they think of as beneficial to them, but often in the grand scheme of things, they are, like, weakening planetary defenses. So when the Tyranids show up, they have an easier time just kind of consuming everyone. Gene stealer cults often span generations. They are nefarious and they are mutants, but they are also alien and I suspect highly classified. So most humans do not know about that even being a possibility. Part of what makes them so nefarious is they worship something called the three or four-armed emperor. They still think they're imperial citizens for the most part. They don't realize they are under the kind of hive mind brain of the Tyranids indirectly, but kind of the asterisk for Tyranids. Next up, we have the Orcs, Alex's favorite faction.
Fuck yeah.
Jolly green soccer hooligans of the setting. Again, pretty sure these are known things amongst the Imperium. Occasionally they wind up in hive cities, and yeah, they just love to fight. There's no real end goal for Orcs except bigger and badder fights. They are a very common guard enemy and a very common space marine enemy because of the Green Horde and the Wog and whatnot. They are the only people in the setting having a good time. They love how fucking terrible everything is and that everything wants to kill them, and that just means there's more shit to fight constantly. Last but not least, on our alien path, we have the Necrons, though. I'm willing to bet big money that, from a tabletop RPG perspective, not a single goddamn human knows the Necrons exist. Mostly because no one survives, for the most part, Necron worlds waking up, so anything that's known about them is probably legends and horror stories. Necrons are the oldest surviving characters, race, I guess, in the setting. They're an entire species of Egyptian-themed Terminators that think of every single living species as kids that need to get the fuck off their lawns. They have no opinion of humans except, we're kind of fun primitives. And, aside for one or two of them, they just think we're, at best, good for clothing. Blade ones have a weird tendency of trying to turn humans into clothing to make themselves feel better because their programming's going bad, but that's a whole other separate topic. Any questions about Xenos?
Yeah, I'm good.
None for me.
Next up, we have kind of the forces of the Imperium you might know. There's a chance you might play as some of these. There's a chance that you will encounter some of these. This is kind of where a lot of my research took me towards, hey, there's a decent chance your characters might not have ever encountered any of this shit. So, the one thing that everyone that's human in this setting knows about is the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Guard is the regular-ass humans versus the Warhammer 40,000 setting. It is humans with standard issue rifles and stuff like that, and tanks, and it's a fucking horde army at that point. Like, in a wargame perspective, it's lots of really expendable troops and kind of cool-looking tanks that you just kind of try and overwhelm shit with stuff. And they're a known thing. Everything here is probably known to some extent, but how well they're understood is a whole other separate topic. And let's start with Space Marines. They're probably the easiest one to kind of explain how maybe this works. Space Marines are a known thing. The chances of an average human having ever met a Space Marine, basically zero. There's not that many Space Marines, and there are way too goddamn many Imperial worlds. And so much so they're thought of as kind of the Emperor's Angels. They're more kind of almost myth than actual tangible thing. People know they're real. Very often, like, Forge Worlds are building equipment for Space Marines and shit like that with some frequency, because they got to build that shit somewhere type of thing. But, they're kind of a known thing, but also people have faith they actually exist. But at the same time, like, they're pretty much an existent thing. From an average perspective, they are legends and they are revered, and the various nuances of the various chapters are probably not a known thing from person to person, except for in action. Some chapters, like the Salamanders, really try their hardest to minimize human casualties and keep them alive. And other factions, like the Minotaurs, don't think of nuking a city as a problem because, hey, if they got the enemy, who cares how many normal humans died as part of the process? So, yeah, encountering Space Marines as a normal human is a mixed bag at best. To quickly touch on them, there's these things called Custodes that are the Emperor's elites and our bodyguards. They are just legends as far as humans are concerned. As the average human is concerned, they definitely exist, but, like, you've never met one. You probably might mistake one for just a bigger Space Marine dressed in gold. They're just, from a pure lore perspective, they are that fucking Star Wars comic of Darth Vader facing off against 10,000 people and him going, all I smell is fear and dead men, or something like that. Like, Custodes in lore often, like, 1v1,000 and go, I was hoping for a challenge today, and win. They're cool. They are, I think, one of the few Imperial things I actually like, because they are, like, pinnacle humans, and they are neat in that regard. Moving on from that, you have the Sisters of Battle, aka the, what'd you call them earlier, Jad?
Large buff women.
The Sororitas. People know they exist, both because, hey, they're basically kind of just better Imperial Guard. They're also the militant arm of the church, so Sisters of Battle coming for you is not necessarily a good thing. Their main purpose is to hunt the Xenos, the heretic, the mutant, and the witch amongst us. They are, those people. And last but not least, for kind of human factions you might have to deal with, you have the the quite literal Inquisition, which anyone got a favorite no one expects the Inquisition joke they want to make right now?
No one expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, that's them. They're that, and then some other things. My notes here just basically says the relationship the average human citizen has with them is everyone knows about the KGB, just not what the KGB does. The Inquisition showing an interest in you is a bad thing. Typically, that means you're about to die. Or worse.
They say, well, you should have fucking committed some heresy.
Exactly. It's your fault for questioning whether... that's actually worth mentioning. It's interesting you bring that up. Inquisitors actually kind of aren't quite as insane as the Sisters of Battle are. The Inquisitors are more concerned with actual... I don't want to say law and order, because Inquisitors are just as prone to kind of exterminating planets, but like in their mind, they're trying to do some good. There's no religious fervor to it, except when there is, but like they think they're being smart about it. Like they in their minds think that like the horrible decisions they make are the best decision. It just unfortunately has a bad outcome. They are at a base level actually trying to make things better, often through some really bad means, but like I would argue that like despite the Inquisition's bullshit, they are kind of trying to make the setting better. They just occasionally make dumb choices like diverting a Tyranid hive fleet and a orc wog fleet onto a planet where they spend decades fighting each other, resulting in fuck tons of Tyranids and superpowered orcs. And then eventually one of those armies goes, fuck it, we're out. And then you suddenly have two super armies to deal with. But hey, who could have seen that outcome coming? And they're also the people most concerned with keeping demons and chaos and all that stuff from the public eye. Again, like the KGB reference is not intentional. They are very involved in making sure that people don't know about the forces of chaos and whatnot, because that's how bad things happen. And they probably do the most demon killing of all the various factions, except certain space marines. I guess the kind of like you as normal people in this setting, you probably live for the most part at borderline scarcity. Like you're probably not going to starve to death, but you're not going to be eating well either. And you probably have what we would think of as modern humans as like the equivalent of a studio apartment, and everyone has that, and it's all in kind of a giant mega block structure that like there's no way of progressing out of. Like the chances of social advancement are low, and you are a fucking cog, potentially below a fucking cog, depending on what planet you live on. There's a decent chance you may only have a job because someone realized making a machine to do your job wasn't worth the materials. Yes, any questions about that so far?
Negatory on my part.
Very excited to play this, though.
Yeah.
Like, that's so depressing, but at the same time, like, oh man, I love Judge Dredd. Unironically, I don't know how the fucking tree towers and everything else like that have always been so interesting to me, just because it's like a little like microcosm and whatnot. So being shoved into like a planet that is just urban decay, and that whole concept is like, man, that sucks, but let's fucking explore. I'm hyped.
Yeah, I guess to kind of put in perspective, the hive cities I mentioned, every single hive city is a little bit Judge Dredd adjacent. Like, fuck, they have Judge Dredd stand-ins that are called like the Enforcers or something that are just copyright-free versions of Judge Dredd down to the fucking helmet. Like, the police force in most of this setting is fucking Judge Dredd. I wish I was kidding. Yeah, again, some of the kind of more fun parts of the setting are direct lifts from just kind of other sci-fi stuff that makes sense to kind of cram into this. So let's get into the explicitly, I guess, for like what makes the setting work for tabletop RPGs. And from a game master perspective, the thing I love most about 40K is it's the fucking biggest setting out there. I don't know of a setting that's actually even remotely at the same scale this thing is, like, which on paper means that like it's kind of terrifying, where it's like, hey, from a new GM perspective, it's kind of like there's so much lore and the setting is so big, the setting even tells you none of the lore fucking matters. It's possible, like, literal mini empires exist within the setting that you could set your entire tabletop RPG in. Like, you can just use the tech and some of the stuff from the background of it. Like, entire galactic fiefdoms can exist within this thing, and no one gives a fuck because they're up by the fringes, or like the fact that they exist is a problem, and a bunch of inquisitors are like, yeah, so your planetary systems actually belong to this guy. He wants them back. But yeah, there's space for almost anything within the setting, which is something I like about it. Like if you want to have a campaign about like international space racers, that's the thing 40K can do. If that's the thing 40K definitely has concepts for, like fucking Necromunda is probably a great source of information for that. Like, fuck, there's a whole separate side tactical war game called Necromunda that just takes place in one city from the setting. And it's got dozens of minis and all types of lore that goes along that's specific to it. It's the basics for all the Hive City lore and stuff like that. And there is, for all purposes, an infinite number of variants on Necromunda out there that you can just kind of repurpose for your needs as you go. I think I touched on this earlier. Like, the setting is just kind of weird where you can have literal knights driving mechs, and that canonically works. You can also have like an entire group of people that have somehow devolved into being space Vikings and live on a planet that maybe humans devolved into wolves on as well, and those are just the fucking space wolves in this setting, which is Space Marine chapter. Like, from a lore perspective, you can basically make whatever the fuck up you want. And if someone goes, how does that work? You can say warp bullshit. And that makes it work, because that's how fucking weird the setting is. I have to rewind back to the joke we made at the start of this. It is intentionally satirical. A lot of people get caught up in making it the grim, darkest thing possible. And don't get me wrong, that's fun. Like, there's a lot of absolutely absurdly over-the-top fucked upness about the setting that we've never touched on, that maybe we'll touch on when we do something with the setting or not type of thing. But also, like, it's a funny-ass setting. One of the factions is a bunch of soccer hooligans that think painting shit red makes it go faster. And because of how that species works, it actually does. But, yeah, we've kind of burned through a bunch of this. Do people have any, I guess, more specific or general or kind of questions you'd like me to fill in some information on, or concepts you'd like to expand upon? As I said last time, me and Alex talked about Warhammer 40,000 stuff. This is like not even the surface level of stuff. This is like skipping across the surface of the bullshit that exists for Warhammer 40K.
Okay, so I was like skimming through and doing my studies and everything else like that, and I was reading into how psychers worked, and that's kind of where I was probably leading. Because you're right, it's up my alley, and it's one of those things where it's like, oh man, that's it's a weird stereotypical character at this point in time for me. But
Dad wanted to play a wizard stand-in? Never.
A wizard stand-in with weird powers that could probably like accidentally cause the character to self-destruct. What? So with that being said, you had said that the Sisters of, it's not Sisters of Mercy because that's a band, right?
Sisters of Battle.
Sisters of Battle. There we go. Sisters of Battle hunt witches. So with someone being a psyker and kind of being close enough to the void and hell, basically, and a possible medium for demons, what's preventing you from being hunted? Is because you're like a state-sanctioned government witch employee?
Yeah, essentially, yes, actually. So it's two factors. One, the fucking Imperium is big and there's only so many Sisters of Battle. Yeah, and stuff just falls through the cracks. Again, like, to put it in perspective, one hive city can contain billions of people. So imagine a planet with multiple cities, each containing billions, and that planet covered with, say, I don't know, 30 of those cities, each containing 2 billion people apiece, isn't important. It's just another fucking planet in the setting.
Okay.
But also at the same time, like, psychers are useful. There's a whole concept of sanctioned psychers. They go through a process that they get some training, like astropaths, or how you communicate from planet to planet in the setting, use psychic. Like, they act as human walkie-talkies, basically, to or communicate messages. Having a psyker in combat, super useful. Why? It's a fucking person that can melt tanks and shoot lightning and take out squads by themselves. they just might implode, or their head might snap, or they might like grow tentacles out of their eyes. And I guess I take this broader for a second. Generally speaking, the Imperium is not a fan of mutants and stuff like that. There's fucking mutants all over the setting. Like, there's a couple known ones that just kind of people in hive cities accept exist. Like, beastmen are a thing. There's a whole, I blank on the exact name of it, but like, cat people are canonical to the setting, as are rat people. They just come from kind of the depths of the hives where the pollution is real bad and mutation happens. They're not going to be high society, but like someone that has mutated and grown scales over their entire body probably still gets drafted into the Imperial Guard if things are bad enough. And people go, yeah, just wear some long sleeves and we're going to put you towards the front, so you're probably going to die type of thing. Like, it's a setting of rules undercut by blatant hypocrisy, where like your use overrides any of the like rules that exist potentially. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, if you can transcend being a cog, you're a useful cog now.
It's like, you're an affront to my existence, but you do this one thing really well, and I'm too lazy to do it. So you get to do that one thing until you no longer can.
Yeah.
Copy that.
I guess the kind of like, again, stuff that won't really matter for when we wind up playing this, when most people wind up playing this. There's a group of mutants called navigators. They are humans that have a third fucking eye in their forehead that if other humans look into it, it causes them to instantly go insane and basically die. They have a hole into the warp in their forehead that looks like an eye, and they are the only way, for the most part, the Imperium can navigate through the warp. So you have entire navigator houses that are definitely mutants, definitely a problem, that are just kind of state-sanctioned. Yeah, we turn a blind eye to this. Why? We can't do the intergalactic travel without them, so we make them an important part of society, and they'll never rise above a certain status, but, like, they're important enough that, like, if you come from a strong enough navigator dynasty, you might throw around some serious clout. Also, like, if you wind up in a fight, you pull the headband off your head that covers up your third eye, and maybe you can kill, like, 10 people instantaneously.
And once again, it's Dune.
Yes, but with no spice. But maybe also spice. I guess, like, yeah, I guess I kind of go into them too. This thing called Ogren. Ogren are big, 8-foot tall. I guess they're technically devolved humans that are just big, hulking, and stupid. And to get them to, like, child-level intellect involves a pretty substantial, like, literally attaching essentially a computer into their brain to get them, like, close to basic human intellect. They are used in the forces of the Imperium because they're giant 8-foot tall slabs of muscle that can work as, like, mobile artillery platforms, like human artillery platforms. They can be given big guns and, like, are oddly loyal and oddly chaos resistant and, like, form bonds with humans and are kind of like your giant 8-foot tall kind of ogreish looking attack dog that can also, like, tank a howitzer round to the face, maybe. They're fun. I like Ogren. All right, who else has got something?
I got nothing.
Once again, sitting there stunned.
I'm probably not going to remember a lot of this, I'll be honest with you.
Aren't some of the navigators like from noble houses?
Yes, that's the navigator houses, yeah. I guess, like, let's talk about this for a couple seconds, too. Psychers in general are unbelievably fucking rare. Navigators, doubly so type of thing. Like, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's like 1 in a billion people is a psyker, give or take. And even less so for navigators. But yes, because of their unbelievable importance in the setting, and because I don't think you can just kind of awaken to being a navigator. They have a certain status they can climb to, but navigator houses are a thing, and they are often a little bit part of the upper echelons of society. They're too valuable to have as the dregs of society.
But it sounds like if they slip through the cracks, then they get smushed out.
I could definitely imagine an Inquisitor or a Witch Hunter of some kind or a Sister of Battle. To rewind back to the Sister of Battle for a second, there's a pretty decent chance that like an Adeptus Sororitas would kill a Navigator on sight because they are a mutant. Like there's a whole other kind of conversation in the setting where maybe the Sisters of Battle secretly hate the Space Marines because they are technically genetic abominations. Like, just because they're on the same side does not mean they get along necessarily.
Through the Space Marines, I'm a big fan of the Sisters of Battle.
They're great. Normal humans in power armor is cool as shit. And the fact that the setting encourages normal-ass people versus the nightmares that are Warhammer 40k, also cool as shit.
This is true.
Yeah, I think the tabletop RPGs in general kind of solve the issue I have with most Star Wars tabletop RPGs, which is they understand being a normal-ass human in this setting is way cooler than being someone important. Like, just existing in this kind of ridiculousness is kind of a cool thing where it's like, yeah, being a Jedi would be neat. But you know what's cooler? Being a mechanic that, like, has somehow survived long enough to be like, yeah, I somehow stumbled my way into a good life. How? I killed some gang leaders by accident?
Okay, so speaking of which, I would imagine we're not going to be going through this power fantasy and everything else like that. What level of like Imperium state worker are we going to be at? Are we like legal secretaries? Like what's?
We'll talk about that in our session 0, I guess. But so the two tabletop RPGs that are kind of current I mentioned earlier are Wrath and Glory and Imperial Maledictum. Imperial Maledictum, you can be a variety of different factions. You don't necessarily really even you work for that faction, but you're more just kind of like a hired hand by someone who works in that faction. So it's more like you got plucked from obscurity by a powerful patron that's like, I see some glimmer of promise in you. And by simple virtue of them having an official title, they are so unbelievably beyond you. Like, if let's use kind of the I can use like a corporate structuring as an example. If they're not even like the CEO, they're like middle management. You're like the mailroom clerk that someone in middle management was like, yes, these 3 mail workers will go and investigate this anomaly in accounting for me. Why? Because I said so. That's why. So the trade-off is that you have been plucked from your coggish existence to potentially actually achieve something in the setting, at least in Imperial Maledictum. Wrath and Glory is more power fantasy. It's if you want to do some fighting, if you want to do some tactical tabletop RPG kind of power fantasy in the setting fighting, that's your game for you. Imperial Maledictum's whole sell is you are shockingly normal people existing in a nightmarish setting.
Yeah, the game is like even set up for you to have like long-term goals that could make you someone important, and then when you become someone important, you're supposed to retire.
That's fucking great.
And it's mostly because like once you become someone important, you're not going to do that anymore. You're going to find some cogs.
Yeah, you're going to find some
expendable.
cogs to do the job for you.
Why the fuck would you be in those tunnels doing something important? You're important now. They're not. We've all watched Futurama here, I assume, right?
Yeah.
The phrase from Futurama, how many wave upon wave of expendable lackey can I send at the enemy, is basically how the setting works. I guess to kind of like take it into more abstract concepts of the setting. The Imperium wages war with Excel, kind of. Like, its biggest strength is the absolutely absurd number of people it can throw at a problem, well-trained or not. Like, the Imperial Guard is a mathematical equation of how many generic people with generic guns plus tanks do I need to apply to a situation before I get the desired outcome. And sometimes your formula is right, and sometimes your formula is wrong, and then you apply more guard to that situation. And by more guard, I'm talking like 1 million casualties a day is an acceptable number of losses, potentially. One of the most fan favorite factions amongst the Imperial Guard is something called the Death Corps of Krieg, or Kriegers, and their entire lore basically is civil war broke out on their planet. They irradiated and nuked and warred their planet into a death world where nothing can survive. Eventually, shit kind of worked itself out. The Imperial Loyalists won, and when the Taxman rediscovered their planet and was like, "Oh shit, we haven't got a lot from Krieg lately from the in our kind of kickback system," they went there and was like, "Well, shit, what resources do you have?" And Krieg said, "We have lots of people, I guess." So a planet that is irradiated and everyone lives in gas masks there, sole export on the galactic setting is people to send into warfare. And they may do that via cloning. It's not really clear how they keep the numbers up.
People just grow like bamboo.
This is a setting where planets have like mandatory reproduction quotas and stuff like that. Like, I think it's the Vostroyans, another Imperial Guard army. Like, their planet is constantly under siege, or their planet is always under siege by something, and as a result, they're like, yeah, no, it's the duty of every Imperial citizen to have like 5 kids that all go off and join the military, because the only thing we do on this planet is fucking military. It is your duty to survive long enough to spit out 5 kids. We'll then have the same duty. They're actually kind of cool. A lot of the Imperial stuff takes kind of inspiration from various kind of aspects or kind of historical warfare parts. So like the Krieg are a little bit kind of gas mask, diesel punk, World War I inspired, as are a couple other factions. But then you have like the fucking Lawrence of Arabia Imperial Guard that have like, they don't even have camels, actually. Like, I think they somehow have space camels. I digress. Any other questions?
No, I'm good.
I think I'm pretty good too, to be honest. There's a lot to take in.
There always is.
A lot.
I feel like if you give me a very specific detail, but it's just a single detail, my goldfish brain will absolutely just erase it. I feel like I'm going to retain this information for a decent amount of time.
No, and I think kind of the biggest important takeaway from this is that, like, the important thing to keep in mind about Warhammer 40,000 is that, like, by design, the setting is an oppressive weight upon all that live there. Like, no one in the setting except orcs are having a good time, and the orcs are only having a good time because they have no end goal. I guess maybe the Tyranids are too, but they have no end goal either. Like, even the Necrons that have been alive for alive, air quotations on that one heavily, for basically the entirety of important history, are running on borrowed time. Like, eventually the Imperium will collapse under its own shitty, mismanaged, hedonistic, or kind of like problematic weight. It's just a matter of time. The Eldar and the Drukhari are a dying race because, hey, when you birth the malicious god by accident, it kind of sucks in the souls of the majority of your population. Keeping those population numbers up are a problem. And hey, also when like maybe making more kids gets that god's attention, they're like, oh, you making more kids? Kids' souls taste the best. You don't do that as much. Yeah, and Chaos has no goals except worshiping Chaos and satisfying the various goals of the Chaos gods. We didn't even fucking talk about the Black Legion, who are like just like comically evil through the entire setting, because they don't matter in the tabletop RPG sense, or they would not be a known thing in the tabletop RPG sense. But yeah, a historical thing we kind of glossed over is that one of the main antagonists, a guy named Abaddon, basically pulled a no, you didn't win, and launched a moon-sized ship into a planet that like kind of birthed the modern setting of the game, where like there's a giant warp rift across the entire setting that makes space travel a little bit harder, and the space hole, or the hole in space-time that existed, got a little bit bigger when he threw this this giant ass ship at this planet that was kind of like the last bastion holding that ship closed, or kind of at least at bay. And yeah, it's a setting where someone can go, nah, you didn't win, and like waste an entire gigantic resource to pull out a maybe W. And it's debatable how important that even actually was in the grand scheme of things. Yeah. That's kind of the basics of all tabletop RPG knowledge you need, or all the 40k knowledge you need to know to kind of play tabletop RPGs in it. Obviously, your mileage will vary. I think it's weird. Having all of this in the back of your brain as a game master is super useful because A, it lets you go, fuck it, I'm just going to make some shit up for this, but it kind of has a certain freedom in knowing that the lore is so contradictory by design and kind of full of retcons and inconsistencies that, like, despite its oddly gigantic scope and thoroughness within that scope, there's so much room to just kind of make up your own stuff for it too. And both tabletop RPGs are pretty good about being like, hey, here's this section of space we recommend you put stuff in. Nothing has been written about it. Have fun. Space is a big place. But yeah.
It's got good bones.
It does. I will die on the hill that despite its many faults and despite the number of times you can point to something and be like, did you just steal this from this? It is one of, if not the best, just kind of like space settings in general type of thing. It's just an unbelievably cool setting across the board. And yes, the war game stuff is the most famous version of it. I think it's a lot more fun to engage with it via the tabletop RPG aspect of things, just because you can tell weird personal stories that like involve you getting involved in some drug warfare or something that's torn between the fucking gene stealer cults that are manufacturing some weird chemical that like makes working yourself, your hands bleeding, ecstasy, and the byproduct of that is that a Slaneshi cult has popped up because Slanesh saw that people are like working themselves so their hands bleed and goes, oh, what the shit's going on here? Oh, this drug also makes people like compelled to like become like the best at what they're doing. Yeah. Single-minded obsession. I can get behind this. Oh, it's a gene stealer cult thing? Don't give a fuck. Well, yeah. I keep asking for questions, but anyone got anything else after that little sidetrack?
I'm good.
Yeah.
I am solid.
I'm very excited.
Yeah. I am too.
I've got a fucking like backstory and shit. I already kind of figured out. Like, I'm good. I am solid. I am excited.
Session 0 is going to be fun. All right, yeah. So if you're hearing this, it means that we are probably about to play Imperial Maledictum. Spoilers, I guess. If you're a Patreon subscriber, that means there will be a Session 0 for this. We walk through the absolutely, I don't want to say unhinged, but unhinged feels like the phrase that comes to mind when talking about the character creation system. It rewards randomness, and that makes it great. Yeah. If you're just here for the Warhammer lore, hopefully you had some fun with this. If you're here just kind of questions about Warhammer, there are quite literally dozens, if not hundreds, of podcasts dedicated to just talking Warhammer 40,000 stuff, Warhammer Fantasy stuff. Fuck, we didn't even talk about Warhammer Fantasy as part of this stuff, and we've not talked about them yet at all. There's a whole second. Technically, there are 3 settings for this ridiculousness. But, yeah, thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoy Imperial Maledictum.